So this talk will be about my work, Sacrum Profanum, which I have been composing over a period of about 10 years, and thankfully will be released on CD through Farpoint Recordings in the autumn coming. So this is an opportunity to talk about politics, how music can articulate political points. Um, Quite often, music is seen because it's not connected with words necessarily. Quite often, it's seen as hovering somewhere above the political, the everyday life. That it's some sort of transcendental, aspect of human creativity, which it is. But of course, music, just like all other arts, has always been at certain times um, engaging with the political. I mean, from Mozart's operas to Goretzky's symphonies to um, Beethoven's Eroica. There's always been at some stage where a composer, not all perhaps, but many composers feel the need to engage with political issues that are important to her. So Sacrum Profanum is this piece for me. So what is this about? What's the Sacrum Profanum? Well, the Sacrum Profanum is based on, it's inspired by a number of ancient stone carvings of female figures, which are called Sheelanagigs. And I knew about these for many years growing up, of course, but it was about 10 years ago I came across one suddenly in Roth House in Kilkenny. And I was quite taken by this Sheelnagig, which was in a display in a museum there. And that very day I went searching for others because they are found on churches, on town walls, in museums, sometimes in castles, or they've been preserved by farmers or families. They have them in their walls where they found them in rivers and so forth. And well, let me describe them. They are stone carvings of female figures that show an enlarged vulva. They are quite grotesque in their own way. So while they have the sexual parts enlivened and enlarged, quite often the rest of the carving, the female body looks famished. There's diminished breasts. Quite often the rib cage is showing. So there's this strange mixture of sexual fecundity and near death. So there's a kind of a birth death cycle that takes place. Quite enigmatic about the Sheilas is their stare. They nearly always stare back, and this became I'll explain all this later, but this became a very interesting feature for me. Also, they seem to have a countenance. So while all these Sheilas basically conform to this enlarged vulva and then diminished look, this near death look at the same time, many of them are very different. Some are dancing, so there's a kind of a carnivalesque element to them. Some are very, very aggressive. Some are smiling meditatively. So they're quite strange and enigmatic. And when I began searching for them around Ireland, and in the end I may have travelled 10,000 miles, and I was photographing them, finding them on farms and up on high walls and in castles. They were not easy to find, many of them, and I spent a lot of time photographing them and taking sketches, taking notes. I went to all the museums in Ireland and in London, and I discovered more there. So there are about 110 Sheelanagigs in Ireland and about 45 in Britain, normally found near monastery sites. So why the Sheelnagig? Why would this interest me? Well, you know, I'd been very interested in colonial history of Ireland, the colonisation of Ireland by England, later Britain. I've always been very interested in feminist ideas. I'm interested in the way Ireland is developing itself as a so-called free state. It's still not a unified Ireland yet, and at the same time we seem to have, as soon as we got rid of English colonialism, British colonialism, we accepted the colonialism of the church. And it seems in modern days that we're accepting the colonialism of late capitalism. So this was an opportunity for me to look at Ireland, to look at Ireland's past, and to look at its current state and to look into the future. So So I began to see the possibilities for the Síle na Gaeilge to be a witness on my behalf. Before I get into the Síle as a witness, however, perhaps I should say that many archaeologists believe that the Síle dates from around the 11th century. I don't believe this. I think archaeologists are looking at the Síle very differently, maybe through the archaeologist's lens only. But if we, with the help of Michael Bachten, look at the way medieval societies and pre-medieval societies were formed, there were often what he calls first life and second life. The first life being the establishment life of communities, where they participate in the laws, they participate in the given church and so forth, or the religious practices. And then there was a second life, which was the life of the carnivalesque, the life where at certain designated times the laws and rules of society did not cohere. People were allowed to be critical of the political institutions, the ecclesiastical institutions and so forth. And so it seems to me that the second life is this element of pre-medieval communities from where the Síle might come. Also, Bachten talks about the various similar early European icons, be they stone carvings or other visual imageries, where he talks about these icons having a biocosmic framework, in the sense that they have within them evidence of all the seasons. The sowing of the seeds of spring, the full flourish could be sexual of summer, the full growth of summer, the slow decay of autumn, and the death of winter. The death that winter brings. And so Bachten's biocosmic model absolutely fits the Síle, which makes me think that the Síles very much date from way before Christian societies. So that's a short historical overview of the Síle na Gaeilge, and maybe using Bachten as a way of understanding the many different stories that the Síle tells us through her body. So I was on my journey around Ireland, looking at all these Síles again, photographing them, sketching them, taking notes, speaking to the people who cared for them, local historians, local farmers, families, and so forth. And I began to see the possibility of using the Síle as a witness to Irish history. So this became then the important point for me, because even according to the archaeologists, if she's around since 1100, she's around since the occupation of Ireland by the English and later British. So she would have seen the entire colonisation of the country. there are four main areas then that I wanted her to witness. One was, as I say, the colonisation of the country. The second one was the loss of the culture, of Gaelic culture as a result of that. The third was the treatment of women by the Catholic Church and by other churches, but just largely by the Catholic Church. And the fourth is an unusual one, which I'll explain later, which is what I see as the contemporary self-racialization, that we in fact create false narratives about what it is to be Irish. So the scan of Sheila's witnessing is quite vast. So how can I explain the damage done to Ireland by the English colonising project? I mean, there are history books about this, and I advise people to go and read them, but you know, the entire Gaelic civilization was undermined. By 1700, let's just say the English came in the 12th century, so there were many waves of English colonialism, but by 1700 and after the Tudor Wars, 85% of land was in the hands of English. So there was a total dispossession of land for the Gael. And what did that mean? That effectively meant that colonialism made a peasant population out of Ireland. With the result is that, you know, we had our own aristocratic political framework. We had our own set of systems for kings and high kings and so forth. We had a deep, rich cultural tradition in the bardic poetry and in the music which was passed down, but mainly on medieval Irish harp, but also in other areas like singing and so forth. All this virtually disappeared. So, you know, that is a huge trauma to a country. And then if we talk about the long 19th century and what happened to Ireland under British jurisdiction is frankly unforgivable. Remembering that in 1840 the population of Ireland was 9 million people, and then we had the famine. 1 million people died on the streets. Just think about that. And then 1 million were forced to emigrate under British administration. So this was genocide. So reel back 100 years later, in 1950, the population is hovering below 3 million people. So the damage done to the loss of population, to the loss of creativity. So this is what I'm thinking, you know, that when you consider the loss of the land, the loss of the language, the loss of the music, the loss of the population, the loss of the language, it's a terrible, terrible trauma that has occurred. So that's the one thing. So very quickly, we move on to the treatment of women by the Catholic Church. This is ongoing, and I mean, I can cite many examples, but we have the laundries. People will need to investigate those themselves, where for having the temerity to be poor, or having had sexual relations, or having had a baby outside wedlock, women were treated as prisoners and had to work under, you know, almost slave conditions, cleaning the clothes of priests. I mean, you couldn't make this up. Only 10 years ago, Savita Halappanavar died in a hospital because the authorities wanted to preserve the life of a dying fetus over her life. My own mother was assaulted by a priest in the 60s after I was born, when her doctor told her that if she had another child that her life would be in danger. She was kicked out of the church for mentioning this. So these are not abstract notions of a feminist movement. These are real things that happen to women, and they've been happening for years. So I wanted the Sheila to be a witness to that. She's a witness to English, British colonialism and the damage done there, but she's also a witness to the Catholic Church and the damage that they have done to men and women, but specifically to women over the years. And the fourth one is an unusual one. It's what I see as what I call this self-racialization, how we portray ourselves in this late capitalist moment. It's been going on since Riverdance. This kind of false narrative of a happy, fully nurtured Irish culture. But I've just spoken about how we've practically lost every aspect of our culture. So this is one of the problems, and we see this in shows like Riverdance, in shows like the Celtic Priests or Celtic Woman. These are kind of abominations, you know. And the problem, I don't really care if they exist and they're harmless, but for me, they tend to brush over actual atrocities that took place in Ireland. They tend to present a picture of nurture and happiness. You know, they are just as bad as De Valera's vision of dancing at the crossroads, which we used to criticise so much around Ireland in the 40s and 50s. Actually, we have a late capitalist version of that. So I'm kind of really concerned that be looked at as well. So these are the areas that my Sacrum Profanum are taking on through the witnessing of the Sheila. So how did I go about this? Well, the first thing I should say is that I'm not a traditional Irish performer. I don't play traditional Irish music. So the idea of taking on Irish culture, taking on Irish music, was really difficult for me. In fact, historically, I kept away from it. But however, Irish music is my inheritance. So at some stage, I felt I was going to have to deal with this at some level. But what music to use, what instruments to use. So, and how was I going to use that music? So just summing up those areas that I was speaking about the Sheila being a witness to the damage done by colonialism, the damage done by the Catholic Church, and the damage done by this self-delusion that we continue, telling others who we are, or telling false narratives about who we are. So I felt that the only way to deal with this would be to develop a kind of an aesthetics of damage. So how was I going to do this? I wanted music that was, and this is an important word, music that was commensurate to the damage done to this country. And so to write happy music would seem like something false. To write music that was fully nourished, music that was aesthetically pleasing, was going to be not the way to go. And so even though I'm classically trained, I come from the European tradition of writing music. Of course, I'm a contemporary version of that. The notion of writing damage into music does not really come into that long tradition. So this was going to be something new for me. The idea that there would be music that deliberately embraced and expressed, either implicitly or explicitly, damage. This was music that was to be commensurate with the damage done to the country. So, and to women, and to our own stories of what we tell ourselves and tell others. So I started off by trying to find a theme that I could run through with this. And what I did in the end was I took quite a famous piece called Bí Isa an Críois. And this piece is an unusual piece because it's revered by the Catholic Church. But I haven't found an author for the piece, a composer for the piece. And my sense is that this piece is an old Sean-nós song that was appropriated by the Catholic Church. And you might know it. So this is Bí Isa an Críois. Let's see, can I play it here? It's a very nice tune, but quite often heard today in rather crass arrangements and so forth. So what I decided to do was what I would like to have done with a lot of Catholic Church policy was to completely reverse that. So I reversed the tune, and this is what we get. So this is not an Irish piece. It's not a traditional Irish tune, but it has this strange modal quality which makes it feel, at least to my ears, that it could be. So in this sense though, it's a piece of found music. And so this tune became, if you like, the tune that ran through the entire piece. It's this tune that we hear, it's this tune that gets damaged. So let's hear one iteration of this with Siobhan Armstrong singing it in Irish as a sean-nós song. So once I had that theme, which I call the lament, that effectively became the foundation of nearly every piece. So this is the river that runs through the piece. I mean, it's a strange piece, Sacrum Profanum, from an instrumental point of view, because there are 4 live musicians, guitar, which I only use with the bow, so there's no exotic guitar, Spanish guitar sound, and it's usually it's a way of tapping into an abject sound that I was looking for. Then there's viola, which is performed by Garth Knox brilliantly. I have 4 solo viola pieces that run through the piece. Medieval Irish harp performed by Siobhan Armstrong as well, and flutes, generally piccolo, standard flute and alto flute, played by Emma Coulthard. So this is the shape of the piece. It starts off with a lament, which is the same as the last movement, the Sheila na gig Shannon song, that I just played and that you heard Siobhan play. And then the three of the 4 viola pieces are interspersed throughout the piece. Then I have a piece using Irish text, because it was very important for me to have Gaelic embedded in this piece. Expugnatio is for the full group, and tape. And expugnatio was the name given by the English for the invasion of Ireland. So this notion that we invited the English in, or that they were just tourists or something, is an absolute joke. They knew exactly that they you know, by calling it an expugnatio, they were calling it an invasion. So they were very clear about it. We should be equally as clear. Then there's an English text poem, and then another viola piece, and then one of the central pieces, which I would like to play for you later, is Hag, for amplified flute and bowed guitar. I'll explain that when we get to it, but this was the pinnacle of abjectness in music. And so for those who are faint-hearted, you may not want to listen to it, because it embodies the Sheila na gig's anger. The Sheila na gig's anger at seeing everything as it unfolded in front of her witnessing eye. And then Residua is for harp, which is really about what's left of the harp. And then there is this collaboration with the American filmmaker Dylan Griffith, which this is to which I wrote the music. So in the live performance, this will be the denouement, I suppose, of the entire piece, before the solo Shannon song finishes as the piece in loneliness, in the Sheila's loneliness at despair at the end. I should say that those who were involved with this project, both performers and creators, and I should mention that the English poem was written by Jona Zeppa, that they fully understood and agreed with my aesthetics of damage approach. So even though they came in as collaborators, they were working within the same framework that I had created for this piece. So in what way does this aesthetics of damage show itself in the music? It does so in 2 main ways. One is an implicit aesthetics of damage. The other one is an explicit poetics of damage, or aesthetics of damage. So, for example, the implicit damage is seen or heard mostly in the viola pieces, where the lament, the main theme of Sacrum Profanum, is subject to all sorts of damage, fracture, and so forth. So in the first piece, Cloran, not only do you hear the viola carving, it's a carving sound. It's not a beautiful sound. It's almost, of course, it was evocative of the carving of the Sheilas themselves. But those who have good memories and are listening attentively will hear that the lament theme is subject to all sorts of fragmentation and brutal treatment. The explicit aesthetics of damage appears mostly in Hag and in the film that you're going to see, Girador, where I try to use our understanding of the Sheila as an abject figure to really kick back. So this is really a kind of a feminist position that I'm taking here. When we look at how women have been objectivized for centuries, be that in societies or within the church, in various churches of various religions, even from the very beginning in the Adam and Eve story, she's the one who's to blame for man's downfall. She's not even a full human. She was formed out of Adam's rib. So the othering of women has gone on for centuries, and it's embedded in our cultures, in our mentalities. And even if we go, into modern day, where we have the issue of the male gaze, whether that's in pornography or a woman walking down the street, the male gaze is something that women have had to deal with. I mean, artists have been painting the female figure as an object of beauty for the male painter and for the male viewer for centuries. So the idea that the Sheila, representing, if you like, the woman who kicks back against this male gaze. The issue with the male gaze, of course, being it's in terms of power relations, it's all in one direction. I spoke earlier about the Sheila's staring back. This is why it became important for me. She stares back. She says, "Fuck off" to you who's looking at me. Do you want to see my genitalia? Here they are. And so in that sense, she becomes quite empowering. She gets to decide how her body is spoken about, how her body is used. She gets to stare back at the male gaze. So that becomes a really important figure. So this is why these two movements are quite drastic in their explicitness. There is male nudity here, there is female nudity here. There's a lot of use of bad language, so-called bad language, but this, you must understand, is the Sheila empowering herself and other women. This is what I was hoping to achieve at this stage. So let's first of all have a listen to the implicit aesthetics of damage in the first viola piece, Cloran. So, given that I am responding in Sacrum Profanum to a visual object, to an object that I'm looking at, it's probably not surprising that I felt the need to work with film, that the visuals would be very important to try and get the message across. And as I mentioned earlier, I had shared my aesthetics of damage with Dylan Griffith, the American filmmaker, and he absolutely understood this. And so the music was composed first, and he responded to that, I think, marvelously. I should say, without going into too many technical details, that in order to try and parallel the aesthetics of damage in the music, he uses a lot of glitches. He used toy Fisher Price cameras from the 70s where the lenses had melted. So the images are rather distorted, and some of you may recognize some of the imagery. So it's a rather explicit piece of film where we try to make the Sheila come alive, and there is one section which is all about the male gaze. And so what we wanted to do is both return the gaze onto the male female body, but also expose what the male gaze, the voyeurism of the male gaze. So so it's an important piece, and in many ways sums up all the themes that I've discussed in this 20 minutes or so of music and film. So this is Girador.